of this event. So today I am here to talk about God's abundance for our neighbor's need. And as Laura mentioned, I am a seminary professor by day, and then I do some blogging and financial educating by night. So certainly a busy life, but this is absolutely one of my favorite topics to talk about, God's abundance and how we see that both collectively and individually. But before we dive too far into my content for today, I want to begin thinking about what stewardship is all about. I feel like anytime we use the word stewardship in a presentation or conversation, we're throwing out a bit of a code word, and we may not always know what someone means by that word. So before we get too far in this, I promise I will explain what I mean by stewardship in just a moment, but I would love to hear from all of you. You already started using the chat, so hopefully we can continue using that feature throughout this presentation. When you hear the word stewardship, what is the first thing that comes to mind for you? Could be a word, a phrase, an image. I promise there are no wrong answers. I would love to see what you put in the chat. Giving. Thanks, Stacy. Sharing abundance. Support, contributing, privilege, care for creation, caring. Thanks for that. So many good words there. Caring well, responsibility. Believe it or not, in research that I've done, caring seems to be one of the biggest words that people associate with stewardship, particularly young adults. Using your talent and sharing. Thank you guys so much for putting your words in the chat. This is really, really helpful. Giving money, time, and talent from Thelma. Thank you. Feel free to keep populating those in the chat as you think of them. Now, I think we can all say that if we were going to sit here with members of the congregation that you're a part of or the ministry that you're a part of, likely the first word that would come to mind for people is something along the lines of pledges, money, budgets, something financially related. As one of my colleagues in stewardship, Chick Lane, often puts it, whenever the word stewardship comes up for a lot of people, they instantly grab for their wallets because they wonder if they're going to get asked for money during that conversation. I'm sure you've had the same experience as well. And yet, when we unpack what this word is actually about, we should be thinking about the word stewardship. That's likely where the word stewardship came from, stewardship. What that means is the keeper of the pigs. Now, the keeper of the pigs was not the person who owned the pigs, but rather the person who was hired by likely a wealthier landowner to care for those pigs. Stewardship at its root isn't about money. And it isn't even about resources. It's about transfer of ownership, or rather the fact that God is the owner and we are the manager. We don't own the things that God has entrusted to our care. Rather, we are entrusted them to manage them well. That is what stewardship is all about. God is the owner and us as the manager. So if you like, feel free to use this picture of the pig as something to think about when you think about stewardship. I know my students at Luther Seminary always appreciate that image to kind of keep bringing them back to what stewardship is all about. But for me, at the end of the day, stewardship is about love. Now, sometimes people bring up love in terms of stewardship, but most often those things aren't necessarily brought up in the same conversation. For me, stewardship is the way in which we live out love for God and neighbor in real and tangible ways. It's a way of putting feet to our faith. And that became really clear to me as I was looking at the Good Samaritan story. So I would love to kick off our conversation today about abundance and neighbors and love and stewardship by talking about the Good Samaritan story. Now, I realize that the Good Samaritan story is a narrative that many of us know well. In fact, probably a little bit too well, if you'll go with me there for a minute. I know I can remember as a Sunday school child going to church and seeing the different stories up on the screen, whether that was in video form or even just putting little images up on a felt board. I have heard the Good Samaritan story so many times that sometimes it doesn't mean anything to me anymore. So I want to help all of us in the room, whether this is a fairly new story to you or something you've heard too many times, breathe a little new life into it. And one of the ways that I'd like to do that is to invite you to read aloud the Good Samaritan story together with me, and we'll pause at different points for me to offer a few insights or ideas, and then we'll continue on through the story. Hopefully by hearing it out loud, you'll be able to hear the story in a little bit of a different way today. I also encourage you, especially if you've heard this story too many times, to begin thinking about this story through the lens of stewardship, because I'm guessing that might be a new lens for you to bring to this story. Now, I'm not going to have you unmute when you read. I realize some of you may be in spaces where reading aloud would be uncomfortable, so don't worry. Laura and I won't know the difference if you don't read it aloud with us. But if you are in a space where you can, I would encourage you to do so, because I do think it will allow you to hear the story differently. So please join me in reading from Luke chapter 10, just the segment that's on the slide. Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this and you will live." So let's parse out the first section of this passage. Let's see what the lawyer is quoting back to Jesus. That first segment, as I'm sure many of you know, is coming straight out of Deuteronomy chapter 6. The Shema, the core, the centerpiece of the Hebrew faith. This is likely something that rolled right off the lawyer's tongue. And that second piece is not anything new. It's coming out of Leviticus chapter 19. So the lawyer is quoting back something he knew very, very well. And yet this parable from Jesus allows us to see these Old Testament passages in a brand new light. In this section of the passage is where we encounter the word love. Now, I think it's really important that we understand what love means in the Hebrew context, because we're pulling out of these Old Testament passages. In English, the word love has a lot of different meanings. I can say in one sentence that I love my husband and I love spaghetti and meatballs. And we know that that word love means two different things in that conversation, and yet we're using the exact same word. The love in the Hebrew tradition was more akin to the love that I have for my husband. Complete devotion, loyalty, or commitment. That's what's being talked about here. I love the way that Alan Culpepper puts this in the New Interpreter's Bible. The importance of these qualifiers, heart, soul, might, mind, is to plant the flag of God's sovereignty over the whole of one's life. God's claim on us reaches to every area of our experience, to our innermost being, our heart, our lives, what gives us our individual identity, our soul, and our energy, strength, resolve, and resources, our might, and our understanding and intellectual capacities, our mind. No part of ourselves is to be withheld from God. What a vision of all-encompassing love that we are being invited into here. A love that requires my whole self, not just what I say, but also all of the actions, all of the resources in my life. A love that challenges and encounters how I interact with all of God's creation, including myself. Stewardship to me is the way in which we use all of the resources that God has entrusted to our care to love God and our neighbor. It is love in action. Now, heading back to the Good Samaritan story here for a minute, we know it doesn't end here because the lawyer has his brilliant and tricky question of Jesus: who is my neighbor? I invite you to read the next segment of the passage with me. And I can't see it, so hopefully you're reading aloud because I can only see part of it, but I'll read what I can see. Down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him. And when he saw him, he was moved with pity. And I would invite you just to make sure that your microphone is muted, just so we can only hear a singular voice within this space. I might invite you to turn on your mics later for Q&A, but it's always good to hear some more voices in the conversation. So let's set the stage here. The road is from Jerusalem to Jericho. This wasn't just any arbitrary road that Jesus was talking about here. This is one of the most dangerous roads in the ancient world. This is a place where you went from point A to point B as quickly as you could because you knew the dangers that could befall you there. So with that context in mind, let's take a look at the three different characters we encounter before we meet the beaten man. We have the priest, the Levite, and the Samaritan. Now, all three of those characters see this man, but I would argue that they see him a little bit differently. The priest and the Levite, for instance, scholars have been debating for centuries why they didn't stop, and I'm not going to join that conversation because we only have so much time today. But I do want to give you a suggestion of how they might have seen this man. I would argue that they might have seen this man as a burden. These folks were on this path for a reason. They were going from point A to point B because they only could get there on this road. There was something important on the other side, and this man might have been getting in the way. Another thing that they might have seen is a warning sign. They knew this road was dangerous, and yet here right in front of them was an example of this danger. Now, I have to admit that I bring some empathy for the priest and Levite to the story as someone who's often traveled alone for work prior to the pandemic. I've often been in situations where I wanted to help someone and just didn't feel that I was able, either because I had other things on my calendar or more likely because I thought I would put myself and others in more danger by stopping to help. And then we have the Samaritan, who does something entirely different. He not only sees this man from a distance, he comes close and he's moved with pity, or in other versions and translations, compassion. His encounter with this man changes his experience. So I encourage you to join me in reading on. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, "Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend." The Samaritan did not just throw money at the man by the side of the road. He did not just bandage his wounds and walk away. Instead, the Samaritan shows up offering all that God has entrusted to his care. And we see so many examples of that just in this section of the passage alone. That's why I've bolded these different parts of text. We see him offering his skills, offering his possessions, offering his animal, bringing him to an inn. But I think one of the most interesting things we see the Samaritan offer is his time. I am a very type A person. I live by my Google Calendar and my schedule. I got made fun of mercilessly in college for having a detailed list of what I was going to do every single weekend, which is kind of the antithesis of being a college student. I'm very organized. And whenever I read this passage, I see in it a call to stewardship of time, which is different than what we often talk about in our congregations. When we talk about stewardship of time, traditionally in our context, we're often thinking about someone volunteering for a specific role or offering an hour or 2 of their time. And while that is good, and we should be asking for that, I think what I see in this passage is an invitation to think about our time differently, especially for those of you like me who are so organized and living by our schedule. I wonder if this passage calls us to ask the question, how were we allowing our schedules to be open to the needs of our neighbor? Would we be willing to be diverted by the Spirit, to serve our neighbor, to be an agency of God's love to someone we wouldn't know or at least expect? Would we be willing to be diverted in that way? Now, a couple of years ago, I was talking about this passage in a presentation in northern Minnesota, and a former ELCA bishop came up to me and he said, "Grace, I really appreciate that the time is the big segment of this passage you're focusing on, but he's like, I don't want you to forget about the money here. It isn't just about the 2 denarii. It's about take care of him, and when I come back, I will pay you whatever more you spend." This man is writing a blank check for the beaten man's care. And then he looked at me and he said, "Grace, I know you, I trust you, and I wouldn't give you a blank check. How many people in your life would you give a blank check to? What a paragon of generosity, financial and otherwise." Now, I have to admit that up till a few years ago, I kind of stopped my looking into the Good Samaritan passage right here when I did presentations, of ending with this kind of paramount moment of the Good Samaritan showing up, being the ultimate steward, an example that we can all live up to, right? How exciting and how challenging for us to have this example of all-encompassing stewardship. But about a few years ago, I was doing some more research on this passage, and I realized there's a little bit more for us to dive into here. Please join me in reading the end of this segment. Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? He said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said, go and do likewise. Did you notice that Jesus changed the question here? The lawyer's original question was, who is my neighbor? Who falls into my sphere of neighborly influences? He was talking about a noun. And yet the question Jesus asked back to him is, who was a neighbor? It's as if Jesus is saying, I don't care about those spheres of who is in and who is out, whether it's the person next door or the person one geographic country over. I don't care. I want to know who acted as a neighbor. Now, you might say, Grace, whether neighbor is a noun or a verb, does that really matter? It's getting late on a Tuesday afternoon. I'm just not sure how this relates to the conversation. And here's why this is so important. If Jesus wanted to answer the lawyer's original question, who is my neighbor? The characters would have been a little bit different. I think this would have been a story about the great Israelite, the Israelite who shows up offering the beaten man, who is the Samaritan, some care. And then the lawyer could walk away saying, okay, Jesus, I get it. Samaritans are included. I need to be a neighbor to them. However, the characters fall a little bit differently. The person in the story we know the least about is the beaten man. And we can only assume from the context that the beaten man is the Israelite and the Samaritan is the hero. Someone, an Israelite at that time, would have seen as a cultural enemy and would be unlikely to see themselves in the shoes of that character. I think Jesus is inviting us to see ourselves in the role of the beaten man by the side of the road, to see ourselves as someone having stewarded to us. Now, stewardship leaders, we are so comfortable with being the giver in the stewardship relationship. We want to be the one that gets to show up and give. And if you're anything like me, we take a lot of pleasure in that role of being the giver. But I ask you, when was the last time you were a recipient of someone else's good stewardship? When were you on the receiving end of God's grace and mercy and love in a way that you would least expect it, from a person you would least expect it from? In my own life, I experienced this a couple of years ago. A couple of years ago, I was doing a presentation in rural Wisconsin, and I was driving back with a friend from this presentation. We were about 2 hours from the Twin Cities, and we had been having a really great conversation. One of those conversations that's so good that you completely forget to check your phone. And about 2 hours away from the Twin Cities, we were talking about dates for our next speaking engagement, and I pulled out my phone and saw that my husband had called me 9 times. Now, my husband is not the kind of guy to give me a call at the drop of a hat. My husband's the kind of guy to call me once if he knows I'm busy because he needs something, twice if there's a serious problem, and 3 times I'm getting really worried. So 9 times, I was starting to get really concerned and just hoping beyond hope that he had maybe just sat on his phone and accidentally called me. When I called back my husband, I ended up talking to an ambulance driver. Turns out that my husband had been in a serious car accident and was seriously injured. They wouldn't give me much information on the phone except that he was breathing and conscious, which honestly, when you're sitting in a car 2 hours away from the city, doesn't offer you much to go off of. And I was in a complete state of panic. This is the person I care about most in the whole world, and I couldn't imagine him being injured without me being there. And so I began calling people, because naturally, what else are you going to do? I knew the ambulance would arrive and he would need help and have someone to be able to speak for him. And so I started calling all of our family and friends. Who could be there? Who could show up for him? And pretty much no one was picking up the phone because it was a Saturday night and everyone was out having fun doing other things. And I was calling and calling and calling and hoping that someone would be able to show up for him. And finally, I decided to call my Aunt Dee. Now, my Aunt Dee and I are certainly not cultural enemies by any stretch of the imagination, but we don't really see eye to eye on politics, on religion, or many other things. But I still gave her a call because I knew that she would be close enough to the hospital, and I had a feeling she might be willing to help. When I called her, she listened and assured me that she would absolutely be willing to show up for my husband in any way that he needed until I was able to be present. But what astonished me was that she was the first person to pray with me, to bring God's presence into the midst of this broken moment. Somebody I would have least expected to be present for me in this was the one who brought God's mercy and love into the midst of the situation. Now, I'm happy to report that my husband only needed surgery on his ankle and on his knee, and he was able to have that the next day. And after 8 weeks of short-term disability, was able to get back to work and is now, years later, about 95% back to where he should be. And that's about where he'll be for the rest of his life in terms of that injury. But in the midst of the short-term disability experience, my husband was sitting at home in our basement, which is what you see up on our screen, and he was really struggling, having to sit all day recovering from the surgery, and was in just a low moment. And my husband's not a person of faith, but one of the times that we were sitting down together, he looked at me and he said, "Grace, this has just been such a terrible situation. The recovery and the emotional experience surrounding it. I just would love to know where you're finding God in this moment." And I shared with him the story of my Aunt Dee. And then we looked across the room at what you see up on the screen of the cards upon cards upon cards that we received from people, close friends and family, but also people that we didn't know very well who felt a need to reach out to us. I told him about all the texts and the calls that we had received, the meals, the gift cards of people who wanted to be present for us. And I said, that is where I have seen God. I've seen God in this overwhelming response in the midst of this terrible situation for us. This experience really broke me open. It broke me open to see stewardship in a new way, because I was reminded again of what it's like to be on the receiving end of someone's stewardship, what it's like to be on the receiving end of God's love and mercy and grace at the hands of those we would least expect it. And it's changed the way that I give. I love this quote by Mary Oliver. "I tell you this to break your heart," by which I mean only that it break open and never close again to the rest of the world. I'm sure we could spend our whole rest of our time together talking about our different experiences of being broken open in situations like this and how that impacted the way that we serve as stewards. But I'll just say this. For me, it was a constant reminder that whenever I engage in stewardship ministry, whenever I live into my call as steward, it's first and foremost about God and God's love for us, and not about me. My experience as the beaten man by the side of the road allowed me to see the person on the other side of my stewardship interactions in an entirely new way. Allowed me to see, like the Samaritan, to see the beaten man not as a burden, not as a danger or warning sign, but rather as another person just like me in need of care. And you see, these two different pieces of the story are connected. The Good Samaritan as the paragon of stewardship that we can live up to, but also this experience of being the beaten man by the side of the road. I love this quote by David Loves. "We are bound together by our shared need, by an experience of our common vulnerability, by a sense that God has worked through so many people to care for us and wants still to meet our needs through others, and sometimes through those we would least expect or want to help us, and also invites us to look around and care for those similarly in need. Might we see ourselves, that is, as those who, having recognized ourselves as the traveler left for dead in a ditch by the road, can now arise to reach out to others in need." The Good Samaritan story is one of the classic stories of death and resurrection. When we see ourselves as the traveler and getting that experience of God's love afresh in our lives, and it happens over and over and over again because we continually need to be reminded. Only out of that experience and that shared vulnerability can we then become givers who have God first and foremost in mind in our giving, God's ownership of what God has entrusted to our care, and not just giving out of our own need to be needed. When I think about stewardship, it has three different movements. Down, the ways in which God has come down to us in love. Now, I know that the relationship between us and God is not just a vertical line, but I hope you'll go with me on the metaphor that I'm using here. And then we look in to see what God has entrusted to our care. And then and only then do we look out for how God is calling us to use what has been entrusted to our care to serve our neighbor. And in down, in, and out, we experience God's abundance in different ways. So I want to dive into that now for just a couple of minutes here. I want to begin by talking about the ways in which God has come down to us in love. I think we can all agree that God has entrusted an abundance to our care collectively. And we see this abundance in a variety of different ways, both in the biblical text as well as in our lives today. And I would love to hear from you guys in just a couple of minutes in the chat, some of the stories or experiences of how God has come down to you in love. So I encourage you to be thinking about an experience or two as I'm talking you through some of the experiences of my own. And apologies, I should have said in the beginning, I live in downtown Minneapolis, and my husband and I live now in a pretty small apartment, and it's impossible to escape the noise. So apologies for the sirens and road noise that you might be hearing. It's getting to be rush hour around here. So the first example of God coming down in love that I'd like to share with you is my experience of creation. Over the course of the pandemic, my husband and I decided to do more hiking outside. I think like a lot of people, we wanted to get out of the house and really enjoy creation and nature. And for me, it's been an astonishing experience to begin to see creation in an entirely new way. To watch the seasons change in areas that we go hiking in every week has just been an enthralling experience for me. And I continue to think about this psalm many of the times that we're outside hiking. The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, the world and those who live in it, for he's founded it upon the seas and established it on the rivers. In creation, we see the fingerprints of God, and we see God's ownership in the midst of that. I've often stood in awe as we're walking through the forest in Minnesota, thinking that all of this belongs to God. All of this was created by God. Similarly, I've also seen God come down in love to me through my experiences at my church. Now you're seeing one of our outdoor services on the screen here. My church is a very small New Start congregation in Northeast Minneapolis, and we are a dinner church. So when we can, pandemic outside of that, we are able to come together for evening prayer, and then we like to share a meal if we can. But something we do at all of our services, whether it is on Zoom or in person, is to do what we call cup of blessing, where we pass around a cup, or we virtually pass around a cup, and ask each other, how full is your cup? And share a vision of highs and lows in our lives. Now, in many congregations that I've been a part of, we've shared highs and lows. Oftentimes we'll share the big events in our lives, weddings, baptisms, births, deaths, but we don't often share a lot of the day-to-day. And I've often found that in church coffee hours, people are sharing a veneer of what they hope other people will hear. And what I found at Tree of Life is there really is this common sense of vulnerability. We share the highs, the lows, the mid-range things, everything in between. We walk together on each other's roads of life. And because we're a small congregation, we can listen to every single voice and how much people want to share. This congregation has showed me love in an entirely new way. I love this verse from 1 John. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us and his love is perfected in us. So I'd love to hear your stories of where you have been on the receiving end of God's love. Where have you seen God's abundance in action? Now, time permitting, we don't have time to go around to be able to listen to everybody's stories, but I invite you to share a few words in the chat or sentence in the chat that encompasses your experience of God coming to you in love. And I should say, it doesn't need to be an earth-shattering example, like I shared earlier, of an accident or a situation of grief, unless that is your story. It can be an everyday example, like I shared, of hiking outside. Excited to see what you guys put in the chat as your example. Thanks for sharing that, Cheryl. Peace from God when grieving. Thank you for sharing that. Dealing with difficulties on the job, Ruth, thank you for that. From Sue Koenig, gracious welcome to a new congregation. Kimberly, safety during the pandemic. Constance, meals provided during recovery from accident. I definitely know what you mean by that, Constance. From Chris, God has given our team at MF a blessing through the past 18 months to grow and flourish to serve our Moravian community. And Stacy, a congregational gift of support to travel to see a parent who is critically ill. Thank you for sharing these stories. I love this opportunity to be able to share stories with one another because we see God's love and grace come alive. I'm a big Bible reader. I love being in the biblical text, but I think when we share these stories from our everyday lives, we remind ourselves how God is still speaking and remind ourselves what stewardship is ultimately all about. So next, we're going to take a look at the in piece of this. So we look in at all that God has entrusted to our care. Now, there are a variety of different examples that we can take a close look at here. And oftentimes in stewardship, we talk a lot about time, talent, and treasure. I'm sure you guys have heard that on repeat, right? But I encourage us to think about other examples beyond those three categories. One of the first examples that I'll often draw people to is a car. When I was first learning about stewardship, I was in seminary. I was a seminary student living in the room the size of a broom closet. I kid you not. I did not have a lot of money. I did not have a lot of possessions to my name. And when I was beginning to think about stewardship, I wanted to think about it in creative ways. And one of the things that I kept coming back to was my car. And at that time, I was driving a Volkswagen Bug. And I remember thinking, how is God calling me to use my Volkswagen Bug to serve my neighbors? Might it be to help some of my fellow students get groceries? Because many of my fellow students living in this dormitory we were in didn't have vehicles. Maybe I need to pick them up from the airport. Maybe I might be able to transfer or store items. How am I God calling me to use my possessions? Similarly, one of my other favorite stewardship stories is about an elderly woman who lived near a middle school. And you may have heard the story before. She would roll up to that picture window right outside the middle school located in her house every morning, and she would wave and smile at the middle school students that walked past. And then she would go about her business throughout the day. And then in the afternoon, when the middle school students got out, she would come up to that picture window again, and she would wave and smile at them again. Now, it came to pass that one day she was not at the window, and the students were wondering, where is she? What happened? And it turned out that she had passed away. And these students were so grieved to not see her there, even though they didn't know her name, they didn't know anything about her other than her smile and wave. They looked her up and they went to her funeral, and they shared with the family how much those smiles and waves meant to them. Because for these middle school students, it was one of the most powerful interactions they had during the day, someone that they could count on having a good interaction with. Because as many of you know, middle school can be a bit of a rough ride. And having someone who believes in you at the start of the day is so incredibly important and was so impactful for these students. I have to remind people that a smile is something we all can offer. Stewardship is for everyone. Similarly, our stories. How might God be calling us to share those stories that God has entrusted to our care? And we just did some of that. Looking in the chat, there were so many enlivening stories there that really encouraged us to be reminded of how God is coming down to us in love. And especially in the midst of those moments where we can feel estranged from God's love, hearing those stories from others can bring us back into the fold again. But as we're doing this process of looking at what God has entrusted to our care, I think we can fall into a couple of pitfalls. One is related to the word abundance, and one is related to the word blessing. Oftentimes in stewardship ministry, the word abundance is used often. The Bible leads us there. There are lots of mentions of the word abundance, and I think all of us on this call can agree that God has entrusted us collectively with abundance. However, I've been really challenged in the way that I've been using this word. A couple of years ago, when I was teaching at Luther Seminary, one of my students said to me, Grace, you're always talking about abundance in terms of stewardship, and how when you learned about stewardship ministry, you saw your life through the lens of abundance. And she said, Grace, I'm just not feeling comfortable with that because there are people in our world today who do not experience abundance, especially abundance in a material way. They may not have food or shelter or clothing. How can we say that stewardship has helped us to see our lives through an abundant lens when in fact there isn't any abundance there for them? Similarly, I think about the word blessing. So often when I talk about stewardship, people will often talk about how blessed they are with certain things. And the Bible talks a lot about blessing, don't get me wrong. But I think about the ways we sometimes twist that language. When I was growing up, when I was in high school, my parents were struggling financially. My dad was in and out of jobs, was struggling to find a job that was using his skills and talents, and was often on unemployment. I still remember one time that my mom and I were out going shopping for things that we need, and I mentioned to her that I needed a new pair of pajamas because mine had a hole in them. And she said, Grace, we just can't afford that right now. And it stuck with me, this idea that we couldn't spend just $10 to get me a new pair of pajamas. We were in a financial struggling situation. And while on a global scale, not much of a struggle, it certainly felt like a struggle for my family. At the same time, I had met these two girls from church that I was really enjoying hanging out with. They were sisters from the same family. And I remember going over to their house for the first time. It was this beautiful, large home up on the top of this beautiful neighborhood and right on top of this hill. And I remember walking up to their home and just being astonished at the beautiful things that they had inside their house, their fully stocked fridge, at the fact that they would never have to beg their parents to get a pair of pajamas because they had more than enough and none of them had holes in them. And I loved being over at their house and sharing in this experience with them. But I'll never forget that whenever we would begin to talk about the disparity between our two different families' financial experiences, the girls that I loved and called as friends would often say, we're blessed. They would never say, we're rich. They would never say, we're upper class. They would always say, we're blessed, as a way to shut down the conversation, as if God had blessed them, but not blessed my family. And this was something that really grated on me. And I never really knew exactly why it grated on me until I began having this larger conversation about abundance and blessing. Sometimes we use words like this to gloss over our own privilege. Because you see, our wealth isn't really ours, it's God's. And it belongs just as much to our neighbor as it does to us. Abundance is a beautiful term, and God has entrusted to us an abundance, but that abundance is in a collective sense. And there are systems, unjust systems of wealth and power that are present in our world today that distribute that abundance unequally. So that we as children of God, some of us have more than others for a variety of different reasons, but these unjust systems are also at play here. We have to ask ourselves when we look in at what God has entrusted to our care as stewards, not only what has God entrusted to us collectively, but what has been entrusted to us individually by some of these unjust systems. Because certainly there's the abundance God has entrusted to us, but there's also systems of privilege and prejudice at play as well. And it's really important that we take those into account. I should say here, I know many of you are very engaged in social justice work. Laura has shared with me a variety of different things that you've done. So I know that some of this content may not necessarily be for you or may feel repetitive, but hopefully you might hear a new way of framing this content that you might be able to bring to other conversations that you're in. As I've been doing my own work, especially over the last year and a half, to look in at what God has entrusted to my care and what has been placed there by unjust systems of privilege and prejudice, I've been beginning to untangle the web of privilege in my own life. And this has been a really challenging experience for me, to begin to see all of the different areas that privilege had impacted. I initially thought it was just a couple, and now I'm beginning to see it everywhere. One of the primary things that I've been digging into over the past year is the racial wealth gap. According to the US Federal Reserve, white families have a median net worth that's almost 10 times higher than that of Black households. And I'm ashamed to admit that as of a year and a half ago, as someone who writes on financial issues all the time and writes on financial stewardship, the racial wealth gap was not something that I was focused on. And it's really caught my attention and been something I wanted to dig into in my own life. Up on the screen, you see a picture of my husband and I at our house that we purchased before we had this apartment. And that is on the day that we bought our house and we closed on the house. You see the sold sign. We had so much excitement in the midst of that moment. And yet, when I think back about the things that God has entrusted to my care throughout my life, my house is one that continually comes up for me. And yet, as I think about how are we able to get that house, I begin to see some of the shadows of privilege included here. For instance, we were one of the first people among our friends to buy our home. And I think at that time, we chalked it up to the fact that we had good paying jobs, we were smart financially. But one of the main reasons why we were able to get this home is because of generational wealth. My great aunt never had any kids, and she bequeathed money to my brother and I when we were in middle school that my dad carefully managed and told us that, yes, you technically could take out this money for other purposes, but really it's set aside for you to use as a down payment on a house. And that is what we used. We used that money in order to have our first down payment. I also think about our loan process. We had a very challenging first loan mortgage process because my husband had some student loans that he was paying through a specific repayment plan that were really hard for them to capture in the mortgage process. And we spent months trying to figure out how we would do our mortgage because of the student loan. It caused a lot of unnecessary frustration and trouble. But I wonder if I got the benefit of the doubt in that process because of the color of my skin. I wonder if people gave us a leg up in that loan process because of the color of our skin or because of other privileges that we had in our life. And I could talk about more and more examples of how I saw this in the home buying process and other lenses of my life. But hopefully you begin to see how when we talk about what God has entrusted to our care and we think about the different possessions or different skills or different talents or opportunities in our life, we also have to consider how shadows of privilege and prejudice might be present there as well. Now, oftentimes when we have conversations about this, especially for those of us that are on the more privileged end of the spectrum, and I am certainly included in that category, we often talk about how systems of oppression have hurt others. How have they hurt other people? But I was reading a blog article recently, and I heard the question turned around a bit. How have systems of oppression hurt all of us, those with privilege and those with prejudice? Because oftentimes they hurt everyone in the conversation. Over the summer at Luther Seminary, we read a book by Heather McGhee that I encourage you to read called The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. And she has a really interesting perspective on this, taking a look at how some of these systems of oppression have impacted every single person, not just those who were on the completely debilitating end of some of those legislation pieces. She writes this: I learned that although we knew about white people, even if we didn't live with them, they were coworkers, school administrators, and of course, every image on screen, segregation meant that white people didn't know much about us at all. For all the ways that segregation is aimed at limiting the choices of people of color, it's white people who are ultimately isolated. And I have to say that I found what Heather McGhee said to be true. In my experience, in my working life so far, I've primarily worked in environments that are all people who look like me, people who have a similar ethnic identity to me, a similar race to me, and a similar economic status. And it wasn't until I came back to work at Luther Seminary that I began working in a more diverse community and hearing a diversity of different voices and experiences. And this goes beyond just race. There's so many elements of diversity that have to be included in this conversation. You'll notice that I'll use race as an example because that's been a particular area of learning for me over the past year and a half. But please know that this conversation is about so much more than just race. So an example of how the systems of oppression have hurt me in particular is in my experience at Luther. As I said, prior to this point, I'd worked in really monochromatic environments of people who are all the same as me. And yet coming to Luther Seminary, I began to hear different narratives that I had never heard before, and particularly around the pandemic. I think about recently, our Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Liam Rodriguez, got up during a meeting and said at the beginning, I'm so grateful for all of you. And we happened to be gathered in person. He said, I'm so grateful to be with all of you in person. It's such a privilege to be a part of this community. And we all kind of thought, okay, he's just kind of giving his introduction. But then he said, because I lost so many people in the pandemic. Leon is a person of color. He grew up in South Africa and has been living in the States for quite a while, but has many family members back in Africa and has lost so many people that he cared about in the midst of this pandemic. And honestly, hearing that story shifted my perspective on the pandemic. Now, don't get me wrong, I had read the data. I knew that the pandemic was impacting different people in different ways. But when you hear that story, when you get to hear someone else's real perspective on the ground, it shifts the way that you see it. Because for me, I had not had anyone in my life so far who have passed away from COVID-19. In fact, I don't even know anyone personally who has been hospitalized. I know people who've had the illness, some more serious than others, but I don't know anyone personally who's been hospitalized or passed away. And that experience shifted the way that I saw what was going on in our world. And I hope that you can begin to think about some of the ways that your perspective has been narrowed, or the way that you've recently experienced or experienced at some point your perspective broadened when you were freed from some of those systems of oppression. So I just want to do a quick check-in point of how are you sitting with this information? This information can be challenging to take in, and there may be a variety of ways that you're responding to this. And particularly if you're on the privileged end of this spectrum, there may be a few different ways you're experiencing this. One is you might be feeling a bit defensive. You might be wanting to put a stop sign up to stop the conversation, or you might be feeling this innate urge to defend yourself. I just want you to know I have experienced all of the emotions that we're going to talk about here, and all of them have a place. And I hope that we can move into new stages of conversation together. Another thing that you might be experiencing is guilt. You might be looking at this and thinking, oh, wow, Grace is adding a whole new dimension to the stewardship conversation, helping me to examine my privilege. But honestly, I just feel so guilty looking around at what I have. Similarly, you might be feeling grief. Especially as you listen to the experiences of others, which we'll talk more about in just a minute, you might be overwhelmed by grief in the midst of the situation. But I hope that at some point, as you move through these different emotional stages and move in and out of them, because it's certainly not a linear process, that you might get to the stage where there is repair. Because defensiveness, guilt, and grief can all lead us to focus on ourselves and not others. And they can inhibit us from taking action. One of the emotions and actions that's really stuck with me over the last year is this idea of repair. I do have grief, I do have guilt, and sometimes I feel defensive. But what about repairing relationships? Laura and I had a conversation the other day about this content, and she was reminding me about how we are all children of God together. And that as we sit down and examine our own privilege, it allows us a new opportunity to serve other children of God in our community so that they can have just as much access to God's abundance. And that is exactly what it means to live into repair, repairing relationships. So the last thing that I want to talk about in our last few minutes here is looking out. How is God calling us to use what has been entrusted to our care, all of this abundance, by both God and unjust systems to serve our neighbor? And the Bible offers us a variety of different biblical examples of this, so we can take a quick look at those. And then I want to think about some ways that we can take action. And I'm hoping you'll help me out with thinking of some ideas there. One of the examples we encounter around God and unjust systems being entrusted to our care is this idea of the widow's mite. In stewardship ministry, I've seen the widow's mite lifted up so often. The widow's mite, next to the Good Samaritan, being another paragon of generosity who gives her last couple of coins and puts so much trust in God to be able to provide for her needs. And while I don't want to completely dismiss that story, I think there's something deeper going on here. And honestly, the folks who put the chapters in the Bible didn't really do us any favors here, because this story spans over the course of 2 chapters, starting at the end of Luke chapter 20 and then moving into chapter 21. We hear what Jesus says, beware of the scribes that devour widows' houses. And then we see a widow's house actually getting devoured. What's interesting here is we're seeing this intersection of generosity. The widow putting in all that she has, in contrast with the rich people putting their gifts into the treasury. In one of the versions of this story, The gifts that the rich people are putting into the treasury is actually the same word as what's used in the feeding of the 5,000 to talk about the baskets of fish and broken pieces that were picked up. In other words, the rich people were giving out of their leftovers, and the woman is putting in all she had. We see this invitation to look out and give generously, and yet two very different responses. Neither one, I think, is what Jesus is inviting us to. Similarly, we have the story of the rich young ruler. Now, if you're anything like me, this is a story that I often don't know exactly what to do with it and would like to avoid when it comes up in the lectionary or comes up in the readings for Sunday morning. And yet, one of my colleagues, Reverend Catherine Malaki, has helped me to see this story in an entirely new way. Reverend Catherine Malaki was talking about how the rich young ruler, certainly Jesus may have been asking this rich young ruler to give up all he had. Certainly that could be what Jesus was talking about. But Catherine invited us to see that maybe with this rich young ruler, Jesus wasn't talking about abandoning all of your possessions, but rather taking a closer look at the attachment we have to those possessions. Similarly, when we read this story through a lens of privilege and prejudice and systems of oppression, I wonder if Jesus is inviting us to consider what attachment we might have to these different systems of oppression that we are a part of, especially for those of us on the privileged end of the spectrum. How attached are we to the privileges that we have received? And what might be we willing to let go of or detach ourselves from to ensure that we can all experience this collective abundance? Another example is Zacchaeus. And I think Zacchaeus really gets to the heart of how we are called to look at God's collective abundance as well as these different unjust systems in our life. You all know the story of Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus running up the tree and Jesus encountering him. We see the ways in which God comes to Zacchaeus in love. Similarly, we then see the interaction where Zacchaeus looks in to see what God has entrusted to his care. This interaction with Jesus, as we talked about in the movement of stewardship, completely changes the way that Zacchaeus sees his own life and possessions. And then he looks out. He not only wants to give away half of his possessions, living into that collective abundance and God's generosity, he also wants to repair a system of oppression. If I've defrauded anyone of anything, I will repay back 4 times as much. Now, it's important to note, Zacchaeus was a tax collector, and he did not define the system of oppression of that tax collecting system. He was not the creator of that system, but he was a part of it. And he wanted to do his part in remedying that system, even just from his place in the corner. The last narrative I draw your attention to is the Good Samaritan, which we talked about earlier. But the thing I always like to bring back to here is that we have a choice in the way that we look out. Oftentimes, unintentionally or intentionally, we can want to become that Good Samaritan superhero-like figure, the one that swoops in, offering all of the different things that God has entrusted to their care, and then swooping back out. And so often as Americans, from a broader worldview standpoint, we can often be complicit in this as well, that we want to save the world without creating mutual relationships. And we begin unintentionally or intentionally to make it more about us than it is about God. I think the Good Samaritan story invites us into mutual relationships where we know and we see ourselves in the midst of our neighbor's needs, and we can be agents of God's love and care, offering all that God has entrusted to our care, not because we have it all together, not because we have all the gifts and they have none, and we can form a paternalistic mindset. Rather, we are able to see them as a neighbor in need of care, just as we have been so many times. So I encourage you to take some steps. And there are some ways that I would encourage you to do so. As I'm going through these different examples, I encourage you to put into the chat some ideas that you have, ways that you've listened, investigated, and acted. So please, please, please put those in the chat. I'm not going to be reading them off, but I hope that you're able to take a quick look at those, if not now, during the Q&A time in just a moment. So I encourage you to take a step. Maybe the first step that you need to take as you think about the ways that God has come down to you in love is to listen. To listen not only to those experiences of love, but to listen to others' experiences as well. Similarly, as you look in, you might need to spend some time investigating. Where are those webs of privilege and prejudice coming up in your experience of God's abundance? And then taking action. And I would really, really encourage you, especially for those of you on more of the privileged side of the spectrum here, to make sure that your listening and investigation does not lead you to inaction, but it leads you to take action. Even if that's imperfect action, taking a step forward matters. So I encourage you, if you've got resources for how people can listen to the experiences of others, please, please, please put those in the chat. I've listed up there a couple of books that have been impactful for me. The Some of Us I mentioned earlier, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi is a great book. Native by Caitlin Curtis talks about her experience as a Christian Indigenous woman. One thing I've also been trying to do in the midst of all this book reading is to also follow different people on social media that I would traditionally follow. So for instance, you see up there a couple of people I followed on Instagram because I wanted to have different voices present in my feed. And sometimes it's a beautiful experience and sometimes it's a challenging experience, but it's really opened my mind up to different perspectives. Similarly, I encourage you to listen to the people around you, those friends, those neighbors, those strangers. Be sure that you're listening closely to their stories. Again, I encourage you to put in the chat any ways that you know of to listen. And I know Laura Watson is a great resource from the Moravian Church that involves some resources in this area as well. Similarly, I encourage you to do some investigating. Where do you see privilege and prejudice in your own life? Another way that you can investigate and listen at the same time is by participating in a book study or a movie conversation, a place where you're not just consuming content, but you're really digesting it, talking about it, and doing that vulnerable work of investigating your own life and experience. One of the ways that I do this with students is we do something called a money and privilege autobiography. I encourage them to write their money stories. And then after they've done that experience, which I'm sure some of you have done before, I also invite them to look back through their money stories to see where they see strains of privilege and prejudice and explore it in a few different areas. Another resource I encourage you to check out to really investigate different systems of oppression that are in our lives is to look at a native lands map. If you do not know the land that you currently reside on and who were the original stewards and continue to be the stewards of that land, I encourage you to check this out, nativelands.ca. It's a Canadian group that has mapped almost the entire globe in terms of which Indigenous nations were originally and some are still today on that land. And then I encourage you to take action. Think about not only individual action, but also collective action that you might be able to take. Both are so important. But in the midst of all the action, especially if you're anything like me, I've been spending some time listening and investigating. And when I got to the point of action, I felt a bit like a deer in the headlights. There were so many things that I wanted to do and so many changes that I wanted to make that I was a bit overwhelmed. So something I encourage you to do is choose your lane of justice. Choose the way that God is calling you to live into this call to share God's abundance with our neighbors in need. And here's an example of that. So throughout this pandemic, as I've been learning, particularly in the area of racial justice, but so many other areas, I've been thinking about what is my role? Should I be out? Should I be on the street? Should I be having specific conversations? What exactly is my role? Particularly living in Minneapolis, I felt really called to be able to take a role and position on this. And something I realized is the best thing I could do is use my voice in platforms like this, on my blog, and in the writing that I do for Luther Seminary and in the teaching that I do. My role as an educator was part of my justice lane. How would I live into this experience and share my own experiences and lift up voices that aren't being heard through my education work? Another way that you might do this, my husband was focused a little bit more on individual action throughout the experience over the past year and a half as he's been listening and learning. Something that he's decided to do is intentionally have conversations with people in his life who he knows are struggling to see these systems of oppression. People who might be stuck in a defensiveness mode and can't really see anything beyond that. And he's had these beautiful, patient, gracious conversations unwrapping for people in his life, particularly what we've been experiencing in Minneapolis. So I encourage you, in the midst of wanting to take action, choose a specific path and then grow from there. All right, and so we're getting to the time for Q&A here. And before we open it on up, I just wanted to say that if you've enjoyed what you've seen here today and you'd like to learn more from me, As Laura mentioned, I do a lot of writing for Luther Seminary on the Faith Lead platform, and you can get to that platform using the website listed there. This is a community hub for faith leaders. It's a private social network. We also offer a blog and different courses. And the best thing of all is that the blog and the platform for communicating with other faith leaders is absolutely free, and it's available to people from across different Christian denominations. And we have people from all over the world. So we would love to have you join the conversation there. If you'd like to hear more about our Stewardship Leadership Program in particular, all you have to do is go to that website, faithlead.luthersem.edu, and then put /stewardship, and that will bring you to our page, and you can sign up for our newsletter, which comes out weekly. All right, so my spiel is over. I would love to hear any questions you have, any observations, any pushback after this presentation. And as you're thinking of questions, I want to make sure to lift up Thelma's God Coming Down to Us in Love example, which is just beautiful. I was in a foreign country where I didn't speak the language, and those people didn't speak a word of English. I was staying without a single word being said, and for me, it was a miracle. Thank you for sharing that, Thelma. It's beautiful. I'm sorry I didn't get to see that the first time.
Grace, I know to be a lot of folks who are here today to be involved in these kinds of conversations in their churches. And I know we hadn't had anybody ask a question yet, but I wonder if those of you who are here today that are part of congregations, communities of faith, who are being intentional to gather to really look at abundance and how it's experienced in your community and the systems that are at work to make it unavailable for some of God's children. If you have anything you want to share about that work that you're doing, because I think that would be affirmational for those of us who are at churches that maybe haven't really started a focus on that kind of conversation. So anybody today that has a positive experience that you're having as you've been doing or involved in this kind of looking in and listening type work?
I just want to talk about the advocating that our church does. And we have Joshua meetings at our church, and people have said to us, you know, we're just so thrilled that you do what you do. And, you know, I sometimes say, well, we'd love to have you join us. And sometimes they're thrilled because no one's ever invited them. And we need to have a place at our church, in our churches, to have these dialogues. And it might just be one or two people. We started with 4 or 5 people. We ended up with about 45 people in our Joshua group. And we veered off into different sections: prison reform and mental health, social justice, all that kind of stuff. But you got to start it somewhere. And our church folks love it, you know, when they see it done, but they often need to be invited to participate.
Hello, we've been just trying to start some kind of justice ministry in a couple of congregations that I've been serving. And one of the things that we're starting with is just to use a film, a video like Raise the Power of Inclusion, no, the power of, anyway. So just to gradually raise the questions for discussion and help people to think through some of the basic biases that we grow up with all the time. But we're just beginning. We have a long way to go with just a few people.
Yes, I have a question. I am just wondering, how are, people in your circle responding to this introduction of the critical race theory, privilege, for white people? Because when you hear on the news, there's such an upheaval of what is happening in the news and the way people are responding to this. So I'm just wondering, how are you dealing with this?
And Ruth, is that a question for the whole group to kind of evaluate how they're experiencing it, or did you just want to hear from me?
Whatever it could be for you, or if anybody else in the group has any experience that they care to share, because it's something that concerns me. There's a big upheaval in the society. It's political and so on. So how is the church pushing back on that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ruth. I'll start, and I hope others will join. We've run into this a lot at the seminary because we are really committed to talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we've read books together like The Sum of Us, which can be a very political book. And I would say that in my experience, the biggest thing I found is that if I avoid certain code words and try to use less politicized language, and talk about ourselves as people of faith and bringing collective abundance to other children of God, people are able to get on board. But when I use certain code words, it suddenly becomes politicized and the room seems to divide. And so that's where things get a bit tricky for me, especially when we want to start about taking action. We have to be willing to find the language to use to help people enter into this conversation in a new way. And then hopefully from there, help to break down some code words. We talk a lot about reparations in the work that I do at the Stewardship Leaders Program, and that's another code word that people can hear and suddenly have opinions on, and it can be a really, really hard experience. So I'd love to hear from other people what they've experienced.
I think that it is true. I mean, Ruth has really raised an interesting point. Anything to do with race, I think, is loaded. And I think for the most part, most of us are not really equipped or well enough equipped to have a meaningful discussion. It simply gets locked down. And I worked for a university, and that was the same problem there as well. So my hope is that all of us, and maybe particularly theologians, begin to delve into ways that these conversations can be had, because we can't move past the places where we're at unless we have those conversations. I'm not sure if I was heard. I'm using some headphones because there's construction going on here.
Yes, I heard you. I heard you. I think
okay.
everybody heard you.
Thank you.
I find just like Grace was doing, using scripture also as a way to get to some of these issues.
I think one way to start the conversation, and you're right, we have to continue, we have to talk about these things, invite folks that, that know something about it, that are educated about it, and bring them in as speakers to your churches and things like that, and start the dialogue.
Well, I don't know. I'm living in Brooklyn, New York, and we are in predominantly Black, that's the word, community. And so we don't have any problems talking about the privileges of the white people. We don't have that. I'm just wondering, how is it that, some of you are dealing with that situation? Because I hear about it in the news, and it is a very big problem, it seems.
Ruth, I know at our church, there was concern and fear about starting this kind of conversation because of anxiety about how people would respond. It would quickly become political. So I really appreciate, and Judy just affirmed this, what Grace did in terms of anchoring it in scripture, because I know we always say that for stewardship. If you're struggling to talk about money and you have anxiety about how people will respond, because they think stewardship is money, ground it in the theology. And I think when you take people to scripture and really help them understand what's there, and Grace, you did such a beautiful job with the examples you used today. I think that's where I'm happy to see at least my church starting to take a step in the right direction, is to use scripture the way Grace did. And I think also we're partnering with St. Philip's Moravian, which is a predominantly historically Black Moravian church here in Winston-Salem, because we recognize that we can't stay in a little echo chamber, and our church is predominantly white. But I share all that with you to say that what you're lifting up is very valid. And it's frustrating to navigate not being bold enough to have a conversation because we're afraid of people getting offended. I think there's a population of people that are going boldly in a way, again, related to scripture, that's helpful. So not doing as much as we need to, but getting there to get started with it.
Thank you, because and it would seem then that stewardship takes courage. That's something we probably need to add.
Well, and thankfully we had a pastor who finally said, worrying is not what we're supposed to be doing. God didn't create us to sit around and worry ourselves. God's going to be there. We trust God. We have faith in God. We're going to trust God's going to be there to be part of the conversation and help us learn and grow. And so again, bringing it back to the spiritual aspect, when so easily we want to instantly put on our political hat.
I also appreciated Grace talking about the various elements of diversity. It's not just about race, it's about your point of view, it's about your culture, your heritage. There's so many other elements that we can also explore that might be more inclusive, I think, less threatening than to begin the conversation with race. So I appreciated Grace bringing that up.
I'm so glad that was helpful for you, Thelma. I was going to add this in the chat, but I'll just say it out loud. Ability and disability, with whatever way you want to phrase that, has been one that I've used with my students as a lens of privilege that has often been pretty well received and less politicized. So if you're looking for a place to start, I think if we're talking about physical and mental ability, that can be a potential opening depending on your community.
Great, thank you.
I just have to jump in and give a plug for that resource, Laura, that you shared with me from the Moravian Church that I thought was so helpful. I don't know if it's possible to put a link to that in the chat or something, but I just thought that was a really, really great piece. And particularly looking at, they have a segment where it looks like at a grid where you could take small action and then moderate action and high action so that people can see a way to begin to grow into this conversation. I don't know if that would be helpful for some of your communities.
I'm on it. Bear with me while I get it.
So I would just love to hear, while Laura's looking, what other scripture passages have you used in conversations like this, whether on stewardship or particularly related to stewardship and privilege, that have been helpful lenses for the ministries that you serve?
Well, we yesterday started the conference with a Bible study. We were in Psalm 36, specifically verses 5-9. But David is basically amongst the wicked, and he is overwhelmed and needs to not be caught up in all the schemes and the plotting. And so he goes to God in prayer, and the verses 5-9 are a beautiful affirmation of all God gives to us. But within that, somewhere in maybe verse 7, the Psalm tells us that these things God is giving are for all peoples. And I think that resonated with some of our folks yesterday in terms of a reminder that God's abundance is for all peoples. So again, if it's not being experienced that way, Grace, to your point, that's on us to do the work to repair. But Psalm 36 could be a different place to go for some scripture.
I think for me, one area would be mission. And it's troubling to me only because I have been on a couple of mission trips. And I really do believe I believe in the passion of the mission work of the Moravian Church. But for me personally, I always feel a terrible sense of guilt when I'm in some places that I visited, because I'm definitely perceived as being privileged. By people in those countries. And the truth is, in comparison, I am. And it's always very difficult to navigate around that. I'm on the line with a former board director, a board chairperson of the mission board. And I don't know if she wants to say anything about this. If she's still on, I don't know if she's still on. And Grace too, if you have any light to shed.
Yes, Carol, I'm still on.
Hi, Judy.
I'm actually trying to put together some type of book about the whole issue of, I call it compassionate sharing. How do we share our wealth in ways that promote dignity and not the paternalistic results of many of our attempts to share during our mission. So I may connect with you to get some more insights into how that should be said.
Okay, sounds great.
I don't feel like I have anything to add. My Minnesota counterpart, I think, has said that really well. I think when we talk about missions, both domestic and international missions, and even our benevolence dollars at congregations, I think can have a really interesting view of not only white, but white saviorism, using that as a phrase. There can be really interesting paternalistic things that happen with our benevolence dollars as well. And so I think it really encourages us to think from stewardship standpoint about how our generosity is impacting the receivers and not just what our experience is like as givers.
Well, and that kind of ties back in, Grace, with what you were saying about sort of you had the superhero versus the heart. And are we kind of swooping in, we're putting some money there versus the Good Samaritan who lingers and makes a much longer commitment, as well as that relationship there. And this also ties in a little bit with what Tim said yesterday for you all that were able to be a part of Tim's keynote. He talked about how we want to try to fix people within the church sometimes and not paying attention to that relationship that needs the work and the focus. So some good cross-pollination of ideas in terms of the swoop in and fix versus the work to do the relationship stuff, which is a much longer commitment. I know we're moving towards 5:30, and I want to make sure I have time to adequately thank Grace for her energy that she put into this content, much of which was new for her. So totally appreciate, Grace, your generosity with your skills and your time to share your voice with us on this topic this afternoon. Any other comments from you all who are on the line? I don't want to cut anybody off, but I know we're moving towards 5:30.